And I'd like to thank the organizers, especially Matthew Rampley, for inviting me to give the keynote to this conference today. As is evident, I will be taking you to another corner of the world, to India, where the British ruled for 200 years and believed that the sun would never really set on their empire. So that is where I locate. I will begin with a quotation that I hope all of you will be able to read. I will not read out the whole thing. It's from this book called Stones of Empire, Buildings of the Raj in India. And what I'd like to just focus on is the last sentence, which says, if the British anywhere left stones of empire in a generic sense, then India is the place to find them. And also to say, not since the Romans, it is probably safe to say, had an imperial people created such a grand range of structures in a subject land. This lecture will take up the theme of the end of empire in India's cityscapes, still dotted with magisterial, often repurposed imperial edifices in styles ranging from the high classical, with its Doric and Corinthian columns that held forth in the early 19th century in the capital city of Calcutta. We see some of the imperial edifices which are still in use. And the styles move on to the newly fashioned Victorian Gothic and Indo-Saracenic styles that came to flourish in the latter half of the 19th century in other presidency towns like Madras and Bombay. Amidst this architectural setting, my talk tracks the career of the specific genre of the civic statue, its persistence and proliferation, and its shifting cast of characters. Now, I should warn you that this cast of characters, both imperialist and nationalist, will be unfamiliar to all of you in this audience, but nonetheless, much of the setting and the forms of statuary that I'll be showing you will be common across the transcultural, transnational history of empires. A close companion to imperial edifices within and against which these statues took their stand, this form of sculpture had, since the end of the 18th century, become the most widely traveling objects of empire, journeying to all corners of a global map of colonies. My focus here will be on the city of Calcutta, now called Kolkata, the seat of the British Empire in India from 1757 until 1911, when the capital shifted to New Delhi, and which remains the capital of the independent nation. Calcutta witnessed, along with other presidency towns like Madras and Bombay, Calcutta witnessed the installation of a large repertoire of imperial sculptures over the 19th and 20th century, much of which remained in place on the streets of the city for over 2 decades after independence in 1947, before they found other refuges. The city's most spectacular late imperial monument, we began the slide with that monument, the Victoria Memorial and its sprawling 64 acres of gardens that was home to a large body of imperial statuary, has remained to date a sanctuary of the empire's caste of marble and bronze men who had once ruled India, with the central honors for the Queen Victoria, who had been crowned in absentia as the Empress of India in a grand Delhi Darbar in 1877. Queen Victoria never ended up visiting India, Britain's most important imperial outpost, the jewel in the crown. But her large enthroned statue stands sentinel at this most grandiose of her memorials across the British Empire. Architect William Emerson's answer to India's Taj Mahal, it was so believed. Conceived of by Viceroy Curzon in 1906, we see him standing here outside the Victoria Memorial. Long the memorial in Calcutta was completed several years later in 1921, long after the Viceroy had left India and the capital of the empire had been moved out of this politically turbulent city and region. Bengal was the hotbed of revolutionary nationalism then, to New Delhi. It is here, on the grounds of the Victoria Memorial, in the leafy shades and lingering shadows of a long bygone empire, that these statues quietly live out their post-imperial lives of oblivion and anonymity. The afterlives of these relics of empire will be a central theme of this lecture, as it explores various moments in the travels, dislocations, and relocations of Calcutta's imperial statues, while charting a small parallel history of Indian statue making over the transitional decades of the last years of British rule and the coming of age of an independent India. Public historical statues, we know, have returned again to the central stage of global attention, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, which called to question the way statues of American Confederate leaders, slave owners, and white imperialists have held their ground for years in the places where they stand, despite the highly contentious histories they belong to. These statues began to face the wrath of anti-racist and anti-white supremacist protests that began to rage across Western cities and universities during 2020. We see here a Churchill statue in Parliament Square, London, surrounded by demonstrators in the summer of 2022. And this rather strange concoction where the entire statue is encased to remove it from public view and protect it also from defacement and destruction. Toppled, desecrated, and removed from the prominent locations where they stand, or literally blocked off from public view like we see here, statues became a ready soft target of the Black Lives Matter agitations and the most visible sites of political rage and iconoclasm. This brought to the fore a series of counter-arguments that we know about on the need for the preservation of statues as objects of history and fine works of sculpture, or on the more politically tactical options of their removal and safe refuge rather than destruction. But acts of desecration of these marble and bronze men have, of course, huge value as iconoclastic spectacle and political provocation. This spectacle powerfully played itself out in country after country of Eastern and Central Europe, where this conference is being held, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, where the gigantic nature of communist statuary brought special drama to the collective labor of their dismantling, creating new lands of empty pedestals, statues lying prostrate on grounds before they were rehabilitated, and special statue parks to house these vanished monumental figures. In post-colonial India too, we've seen how statues and busts have borne the brunt of the turbulent identity politics of caste, language, and ethnicities across different states and sub-states that have grown. There's a large body of scholarly writing now that have closely studied this volatile symbolic politics of statue making and statue breaking across Indian cities as part of the rites of passage between different official regimes, the competitive rituals of commemoration and veneration, the claims over public spaces, and most importantly, the surging representational politics of the Dalit movement. Dalit movement represents the movement of the lower caste groups for respectability. The word Dalit literally means downtrodden, and B.R. Ambedkar, the architect of the Indian Constitution, emerged as the major Dalit leader, and the movement still considers him its greatest icon. While statues and busts of the figure of B.R. Ambedkar are frequently targets of desecration by opponents and upper caste marauders, Protective railings and police cordons often bear testimony to the endangered lives of many other statues of India's national and regional leaders in the face of political antagonisms. Ironically, though, in the build-up to the independence and in its aftermath, the country's vast repository of imperial statuary were left relatively unscathed, as they were moved up the streets to less visible locations in different stages in different cities. What the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement and its hue and cry about the rights to exist of a certain body of statuary did was to return attention in India to these long forgotten and obscured specimens of colonial statuary hidden away in various parts of our cities. In my talk today, I'll be taking you through the shifting cast and sites of Calcutta's colonial statuary and their post-colonial destinies, uncovering, as I said, the many stories of travels, transfers, and relocations that lie behind these imposing and apparently immovable figures. One of the concerns in my larger work on statues is to think about the form and materiality of these objects and the work of embodiment that they perform. What the politics of statuary takes for granted is that the statue functions as the stand-in for the person itself. This innate belief drives as much the authorities and communities who commission their making in prominent public spaces as those who will their removal or destruction under changing ideological compulsions. But we could keep asking, how far is the inanimate statue the person it represents? How may we conceive of the personhood of this genre of civic statuary? And why is it that despite their largeness and privileged locations, urban public statuary are usually rendered the least visible and most ignored objects of public spectatorship? Standing atop their conical pedestals, set against the light at different times of the day, these statues typically inhabit the Calcutta city's streetscape as dark and abstracted silhouettes, an outsized, outstretched arm marking out an Indian nationalist military hero, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's call of his march against the empire, or the trademark walking stick marking a marching Mahatma Gandhi of the civil disobedience movement. Their placement high above eye level in crowded locations and avenues, meant mainly for moving traffic, makes close viewing impossible, and photographing the details of the statue a great challenge. The cultural theorist W.J.T. Mitchell, in his essay titled "What Do Sculptures Want?", tells us of sculpture's deep longing for a place and an ideal locus. The statues here can be seen to have slipped from such a desire for a place to become places in themselves, functioning more effectively as city landmarks than as figural likenesses. Statues, I will be arguing, have long been consigned to a liminal status of being neither a work of art nor an icon, of fully belonging to neither high nor popular visual culture. Compared to the visual charge of other popular or political iconographies in the contemporary image-saturated streetscapes of our cities, this corpus of civic statues stand emptied of animation and effect, as stilled and dead as the people they embody, springing to attention usually only through their brief moments of consecration or occasional acts of vandalization. Once restored or replaced, they routinely return to their invisibility and oblivion. The paradoxical status of these statues are intensified by the way this representational genre keeps reproducing itself across official and unofficial sites as the continuing chosen form of memorialization of public persons. Public disinterest has far from halted or even altered the thriving career of this genre of civic statuary. How may we trace his continuing efficacy and unending life as a repeating template of public monuments and memorials then, in a city like Calcutta, where the genre of statue stands caught in the historical bind of the passage from India's colonial to post-colonial histories. The first section is called Calcutta's Imperial Statuary and its post-colonial substitutions. Now, as is true for a large part of the colonial world, stretching from North and South America to Australia and New Zealand, this form of urban civic statuary arrives in India with the early British Empire and has a quintessentially colonial history of its inception and growth in different cities of the British presidencies and even in the royal princely states. The giant public statues of rulers and notables of empire, initially made in marble, with a preference later shifting to bronze casting, were among the most monumental and widely traveling objects of British India, with Calcutta and London operating as the two central depots of orders and supplies. Throughout the early 19th and early 20th centuries, these statues, commissioned from India and largely financed by public subscriptions raised by committees set up in India and London, were made in stone sculpting studios and bronze casting foundries in England, and then laboriously transported to India for installation at designated memorial sites, with several years elapsing between the time of their commissioning and their final arrival in different cities of the empire. So this was the case with the statue we see here of Sir James Outram, the military hero of the siege of Lucknow during the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, which was one of the greatest revolts to unsettle the empire. And it coincided with the transition of empire from the East India Company's possession to that of the Crown of England. So here we see John Henry Foley's famous equestrian statue of Lieutenant General Sir James Outram, the military hero of the siege of Lucknow of the Sepoy Mutiny, now standing in the Victoria Memorial grounds. Following the commission given to Foley in 1861 by a combined London and Calcutta committee, the government of India had to send across to London 11 tons of gunmetal for casting of the figure, the finished form of which was transported to Calcutta 13 years later and ceremonially unveiled, initially in a location on Park Street in Chorangi Crossing, before it would be removed to the Victoria Memorial after independence. As cultural commodities, these statues thus contain within them elaborate and prolonged material histories of production, transactions, and travels, linking the metropolitan and colonial topographies of the memorialization of imperial power. Within the colony, especially as in a city like Calcutta, these monumental objects continued to change locations and occupy new sites of display and attention. This was especially the case when the city's grand monument of the Victoria Memorial was completed in 1921. And several statues that today seem an integral part of the building and its grounds actually moved here from other locations. There's an important turn of nationalist history at this juncture that propels this move. The completion and opening of the Victoria Memorial coincided with the passing of municipal electoral power in the Calcutta Corporation to the representatives of the Indian National Congress and the town hall, which came under their authority. So the removal of imperial statues from the premises of the town hall was a proposal of the new leaders of the Calcutta Corporation that concurred well with imperial plans for the new Victoria Memorial and its grounds. One of the first statues to move was this first commissioned statue of the British Empire in India, that of Marquis Cornwallis, India's third Governor General, that was made in London for the British Indian Empire and transported to Calcutta in 1803. A work of John Bacon Jr., Cornwallis here is masquerading as a fake Roman emperor. The mark of its fakeness written into the very body of this impersonation in the way we see the marble head of Cornwallis is transplanted onto a copy of an antique Roman figure of the kind that were routinely produced by the sculpting studios of London and greatly in demand in the period's new classical idiom of imperial statue. Cornwallis's statue first stood in the parade grounds of the new Fort William in Calcutta, for which it had been intended to be a distinguished ornament, I quote, before it was moved to the city's neoclassical edifice of the town hall when it came up in 1813. The Cornwallis statue, like the Outram one, becomes another case of a traveling statue moving between different city locations before it finds its secured place in the eastern quadrangle of the Victoria Memorial, where it still remains. In tandem with the statue of Cornwallis, Richard Westmacott's 1828 marble sculptural group of India's second Governor-General, Warren Hastings, again robed in a Roman toga, flanked here by a classicist figure of a Brahmin Pandit and a Muslim scribe, was also relocated from the portico of the town hall to the west quadrangle of the Victoria Memorial in 1921. What also moved from the street in front of the town hall, as we see in an old, not very good photograph, to the Victoria Memorial grounds was another later sculpture of Richard Westmacott, the bronze statue of the Benthamite utilitarian Governor-General Lord Bentinck, who served the empire in the 1830s as the flag bearer of social and educational reform. And we see his pedestal commemorating one of his main acts of social reform, the abolition of the practice of widow burning on the fire of their husbands called sati. So this sculptural panel commemorates that. It would be several decades before Lieutenant James Outram's equestrian statue would also be moved into the Victoria Memorial grounds. It was the last colonial statue to move from a street location to the sanctuary, but also the first of these men of empire to be dislocated after independence to make room for the most iconic of India's national leaders, Mahatma Gandhi. This was 11 years after independence in 1958, when Outram had to forego his prime habitus in the center of the city and make place for the first officially commissioned statue of Mahatma Gandhi that was sculpted by the Indian academic sculptor Devi Prasad Rai Chaudhary and installed here a decade after Gandhi's assassination in 1948. I'll be returning again to this Gandhi statue at the end of my talk. It is tempting to think of this sculptural substitution as publicly signaling the end of empire in the post-colonial city. But the large body of Outram's bronze imperial peers would be left to stand where they were for several more years. Calcutta's imperial statuary all remained in place for 2 decades after the end of empire, not just closeted within the gardens of the Victoria Memorial, but throughout the main thoroughfares of the city. The reasons were many. The immediate post-independence decades saw the city of Calcutta still grappling with the aftermath of the wartime man-made famine of 1983, the Hindu-Muslim riots of 1946, which would continue through the 50s, the partition of the subcontinent into India and Pakistan on the east and the west, and the flood of refugees from East Bengal, which had then become East Pakistan, who had to be accommodated in temporary camps and settlement colonies. So I think in Europe, you'll understand what a refugee crisis looks like now. With the population of the West Bengal exploding under the refugee influx, the new Congress government was confronted not just with the primary burden of refugee rehabilitation, but also with the attendant scenario of a collapsing health and housing infrastructure, overburdened public food distribution system, resulting in acute food shortage, a cholera epidemic, inflation, unemployment, and immiserization of various sections of the population. It is hardly surprising then that the removal and replacement of colonial statuary were the last priorities of this embattled government department and the government departments and the Calcutta Corporation. On 15th August 1947, the day of the transfer of power in the city, crowds of people did break into the government house and freely took away various memorabilia. But it was reported more in euphoria than in anger. And in the months and years that followed, in the communally and politically turbulent city, crowd violence was targeted less against imperial symbols and more against the new authorities in power, especially with the Communist Party and its trade unions pitted against the Congress government. This continuing turmoil leads us to the end of the 1960s, to the freshly violent political milieu caused by an extreme revolutionary Maoist left group, the CPI, the Communist Party of India, Maoist-Leninists, which took on the local name of the Naxalites. This is the time of the height of the anti-American agitations also because of the Vietnam War. It was in the face of this Naxalite uprising and its violent political iconoclasms that Calcutta began to finally witness a spate of dislodging, replacement, and relocations of its imperial statuary to outskirts of the city. Ironically, it was to protect these statues against the idol-breaking manifesto of the Naxalite cadres that their removal became imperative. But what was even more ironical was that the Naxalites had as their main targets not the bronze cast figures of white imperialists, but those whom they saw as their Indian bourgeois compradors, the intellectual upper-class leaders of 19th century Bengal's cultural renaissance. So here is one of those figures, the educational and social reformer, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, being beheaded. So sadly, the sculpted heads that rolled in the hands of the Naxalites during 1969-70 were those of figures like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar that stood in College Square, the hotbed of political violence of those years. In contrast, the imperial statues under the custody of the government were to find the same refuge. In a short sweep between 1967 and 69, during different phases of the Communist and the Congress governments, all the statues of colonial rulers were programmatically removed off the city streets by the Public Works Department and transported to the grounds of the Flagstaff House in the nearby cantonment town of Barakpur. So this is the Flagstaff House to which they moved, leaving untouched the large group of imperial statuary that stood inside the Victoria Memorial Grounds. Never destroyed or vandalized, as was the case with some of the colonial statuary in a city like Bombay in the 1950s and the violence attending the state formation of Maharashtra. The Calcutta statues lay strewn in these premises in unkempt wilderness, but untouched. Several decades later, at the turn of the millennium, these statues came to be carefully rehoused around their neoclassical war cenotaph and set up on new brick pedestals on the lawns of Flagstaff House. The equestrian and standing statues cleaned, restored, and neatly laid out in coordinated groups on both sides of the Flagstaff House grounds, where they still stand. Over the 1970s, under the Second United Front, which is a combination of the Communist and Congress governments, and the newly elected Left Front regime that came to power in 1977, they began a strange musical chairs game of statue substitution, with Bengali revolutionary and nationalist leaders of the early and mid-20th century taking their stands on the pedestals emptied of the colonial masters. So, for instance, in 1970, veteran Bengal Congress leader and the first Indian head of the Calcutta Corporation, Deshbandhu Chittaranjan Das, came up in the island where an equestrian Lord Canning had stood for 90 years before he was banished to the river banks at Barakpur to keep company with the ornate tombstone of his wife, Lady Canning, who had died in this cantonment town. In 1972, a sculpture of the young revolutionary martyr Khudiram Bose replaced Lord Auckland on the same plinth at the juncture of the State Assembly House, with the Auckland statue traveling all the way to the city named after him in New Zealand. Next, in 1976, the figure of another Bengali revolutionary leader, Surya Sen, the leader of the legendary Chittagong Armory raid of 1930, took Lord Northbrook's place against the Gothic majesty of the Calcutta High Court building. This is when, and I've shown you just a few examples, when the nationalist statue mania that took off from the 1940s, from its 19th century colonial precedents, reached its post-colonial peak. This is also when this quintessentially colonial genre figurative sculpture found itself settling into its domesticated career as a local representational and commemorative practice. The replacement figures that kept cropping on these empty pedestals often look distinctly awkward in their substitution and subversions of the imperial masters. This is all too evident in the rows of nationalist leaders that we encounter when we drive by in the stretch from the Victoria Memorial past the greens of the Maidan onto the thick traffic of Esplanade. We see here a stiffly swaddled, misshapen, spiritual seer, Aurobindo, a Bengal revolutionary who had turned into a spiritual leader, occupying the place of the statue of Lord Curzon, which we saw earlier, ironically even occupying the same grand, ornate and sculpted pedestals, turning his back pointedly on the Victoria Memorial. Or we see a figure of a Bengal revolutionary awkwardly straddled on a horse, which is unlikely that he would ever have ridden, at the crossing of Queensway and Casuarina Avenue to somehow keep pace with the many imposing equestrian figures of British kings, governors, general, and viceroys. Or we see, sorry, 1 minute. Marching flag-carrying figure of Matungini Hazra, an elderly lady who was an activist of the Quit India movement from the district of Midnapur, who was felled by police bullets in August 1942. Matungini, before she was felled by the police bullets, stands here as Calcutta's first monumental female nationalist statue, rivaling in its statuesque bulk the many Queen Victorias that had come up at the turn of the 20th century. Calcuttans have responded to some of these post-colonial street sentinels with more mockery than reverence, with a repeated refrain about the failure of our nationalist statuary to match up to the pomp and finesse of their colonial predecessors. So I come to the next section called Statues, Not Sculptures. Here, I'd like to explore this crucial distinction between the categories of sculpture and statuary, a distinction of quality, aesthetics, style, and function. This distinction is used to sift out the fine art of colonial statuary from its lesser proliferating post-colonial variants within Indian cities. In what ways, we could ask, do statues fall short of being sculpture? And when and in what context can they move from one nomenclature to the other? The claims and designations of art operate here as the critical marker that differentiates sculpture from mere statuary. Even as it has grown out of the same materials and processes of production, statues have had to struggle to establish themselves as a form of sculpture in its own right, and to acquire a status as works of art. Over the years, Calcutta's rich repository of statuary of the colonial period, which we saw, dating from the early 19th century to the middle years of the 20th century, has found such an acknowledgement, attracting close artistic scrutiny and research about their making and makers, featuring within a growing corpus of specialized studies on British sculpture and the Indian Empire. A wave of historical and aesthetic attention turned on what is termed as the British National School of Figurative Realist Sculpture in its thriving career in the history of British imperialism. London by the early 19th century is shown to emerge as the sculptural capital of the world and evolve as a special hub of sculptural cosmopolitanism in the long Victorian era, with the influx of the best of continental sculptors, especially from Italy and France, to London. Calcutta's long cast of marble and bronze imperial men can be placed within these detailed histories of the sculptural commissions and productions that move between the colony and the metropolis, charting the transition from the early preponderance of marble and neoclassical allegorical styles like we see in the statue of Cornwallis to the later premium on realist gigantic bronze casting, which we see with the figure of Emperor George V, which is the last of colonial statuary to find its place in the city. Okay. Now, practically each of Calcutta's colonial period statuary has in the process acquired an individuated identity as an artwork associated with the studio and style of a known sculptor of the period, with the names of these artists and foundries engraved on the body of the object, usually in the pedestal. So, for instance, these grand equestrian figures of Lord Hardinge on the left and Outram on the right, erected in 1859 and 1974, are now regularly searched out by visiting scholars as the finest examples of the mid-20th century sculptures of John Henry Foley. And there are a series of young and old Queen Victorias made in different periods of her reign, which inhabit the city of Calcutta, and some that came up in the aftermath of her death by sculptors like Marshall Booth's, which we see here, the first statue of the young queen made on the occasion of her being crowned the Empress of India in 1877, which stands within the Indian Museum, Calcutta, or this later one by George Frampton, which we've already seen, which is first commissioned, set up before the memorial comes up, and then relocated at its entrance. So, from the earliest marble statue of Lord Cornwallis, sculpted in 1803, to the last imperial bronze of Emperor George V, made in 1938 by the Scottish sculptor William Macmillan, Calcutta's colonial statues can be situated within a changing history of techniques and stylistic conventions of the British schools of figurative sculpture. Now, it is in the quiet exile of their post-colonial locations, in the serenity of the grounds of the Barrackford Flagstaff House, or in the picturesque gardens of the Victoria Memorial, that these statues today make themselves available for the close and specialized study of their sculptural form. In the one side, they're open to viewing only by select groups of dignitaries, visitors, and scholars by special appointment with the Calcutta Raj Bhavan, which is now the governor's residence, to enter this Flagstaff House at Barrackford. In the other site at Victoria Memorial, they are used as backdrops on seating spots for courting couples and wishing to be photographed, who have no clue or interest about who these bronze figures are. These lie waiting to be searched out again and professionally photographed, largely by traveling British scholars. Emptied of the personhood of colonial rulers, these statues, I would argue, have made their unintended transition into becoming pure works of sculpture, albeit with the prefix figural to set it apart from the broader denomination of modern sculpture and place it within the specific genre of its own. It is in the secluded intimacy of his Barrackpore residence that West Bengal's one-time governor, Gopal Krishna Gandhi, decided to launch his witty conversation with the 12 statues on the grounds of the Flagstaff House, whom he considered to be really the house's only true residence. Admiring the Greek godlike marble body, waving hair and perfectly made boots of the young Captain William Peel, he wondered why fate had made this handsome youth die, not a hero's death on the battlefield, but of the dreaded Indian smallpox. Looking at the water stains on the patina of the head of Emperor George V, now brought to eye level on the steps of the cenotaph, Gopal Krishna Gandhi sympathized with His Majesty perspiring under the burden of his crown and heavy robes, while he also empathized with the way Lord Napier, we see on the left, stands lost under his oversized helmet and obscured by an even bigger horse pushing his nozzle into the trees. And as Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, Gopal Krishna Gandhi even pondered on how the launch of the first non-cooperation movement must have squeezed out the pomp and thrown into deep worry this unusual figure of the thoughtful, brooding, bald Secretary of State, Lord Montagu, who we see on the right, sculpted by K. Hilton Young and inscribed on his pedestal as a ruler who from 1917 to 1922, amidst great events, greatly served the empire and people of India. No such scholarly attention or empathy, unfortunately, lies in store for the nationalist statues as they stand alone and ignored and barely seen among the crowds and traffic in the congested heart of Calcutta. Nor, with the exception of one local antiquarian scholar who produced a dictionary on Calcutta statues, has there been any equivalent trend of scholarly or art historical interest in the form and style of these colonial and nationalist statuary, in who may have sculpted them, or in what occasion their making and placement in these locations? Most telling is the way. The identity of the sculptors who were commissioned to make these figures stand in complete erasure. The plaques on the plinth, again of Vidyasagar, the figure who was beheaded by the Naxalite agitators. Here we see him there, identified, but on the plinth we have the name and biographical detail of him and details of all the dignitaries who were present at the unveiling of the function, but nothing about the sculptor. Almost never is there a name to be read and reckoned of the sculptor who produced the likeness. This information on the maker is the one that seems the least necessary and the most redundant in the public and official lives of these post-colonial statues. This absence is what most insistently shows up the failure of these objects to qualify as works of sculpture, even as they barely fulfill their commemorative duties to the persons they set out to immortalize. Ritually fettered at every birth or death anniversary, nobody bothers thereafter to remove the dried garlands that remain strung around them for the rest of the year. We see this with Devi Prasad Gandhi's statue. The graciousness and unexpected delicacy of feeling, I quote here the British scholar Richard Barnes, with which the city's civic authorities are seen to have relocated its colonial statuary, plays itself out against its callous disregard of the statues of its own leaders. Now, how am I doing for time? Have I run out of time, or can I read the last section of the paper?
You have 5 minutes.
How many more minutes?
5.
Okay, I'll try and round up in 5 minutes, but it could be 10. And is that too much? Otherwise, okay. I have a last section which is called Towards a Local History of Statue Making in the City, where I look very briefly at the early history of the transference of the practice of statue making from British to Indian sculptors, from the colonial to the new nationalist civic authorities of the Calcutta Corporation in the decades preceding independence. It is significant to note that the Congresses coming to power in 1923 within the municipal body brought a halt in the erection of statues of colonial rulers in the cities of Calcutta. This is the time when the first statues of Indian nationalists and notables began to compete with their colonial counterpart in the main junctions of the city. With the first group of Indian art school trained academic sculptors taking over these commissions and productions. We could mark here an inceptionary tradition of the flourishing of an academic realist style of figurative sculpture before our nationalist and post-colonial statuary begin to lose their finesse and the practice trails into popular mass production. What I do in this section, and I'm not going to read it all out, is I look at the careers of a few such Indian statue makers, many of whom come from the hereditary communities of clay image makers who would make religious statuary for festivals. One of them was G. Paul and Sons, who went to Wembley to the Indian Empire exhibition as an artisan skilled in clay sculpture making. From there, he received a scholarship to travel to Italy to study marble statuary. And when he returned, he sets up his own studio, where he begins to specialize primarily in marble, bust, and full-size statue making. And one of the most important of the figures that Gopeshwar Pal sculpted was this figure of an Indian industrialist entrepreneur, one of the few Indian figures who occupies the lawns of the Victoria Memorial, which is largely a space for imperial statuary. Now, it is interesting that the reason he finds his way into the memorial from the place he first occupied in front of the Martin Burn office. The Martin Burn is one of his firms in which he holds a large share. And this was the firm which was involved in the construction of the Victoria Memorial. So it is in the grounds of the Victoria Memorial that Sir Rajendra Mukherjee, a partner of the firm of Martin Burn and Company, made by an Indian sculptor, Gopeshwar Pal, found its place. I'd like to quickly jump from here to the career of the academic realist sculptor we've already met, Devi Prasad Rai Chaudhary, a graduate from the Government College of Art, Calcutta, who had a career in landscape painting, portraiture, and commission sculpture before becoming the first official national sculptor of independent India. Devi Prasad can be seen to step in and take over a practice that was still largely a monopoly of Western sculptors. In the two prestigious commissions he took on of making bronze sculptures, one of the first Vice-Chancellor of Calcutta University, Ashutosh Mukherjee, and the other of an early nationalist leader, Surendranath Banerjee, which he completed in 1941. There are fascinating material histories to be uncovered here of the long travels of objects and technologies that lie behind the making of these statues. At a time when the technology for making bronze sculptures was still to come up in the city, both these figures made by Devi Prasad, and we're thinking particularly of this one, traveled as a plaster of Paris model all the way to Italy to be cast in bronze and returned to Calcutta, with even the stone pedestal of the statue ordered and shipped from the sculpting studios in Italy. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the completed 11-feet bronze figure of Surendranath Banerjee, along with its 14-feet pedestal, remained trapped as enemy property in a captured Italian ship at the Calcutta docks, till the Calcutta Memorial Committee secured its release from the ship and had it erected in Esplanade's Curzon Park. In Devi Prasad's statue of Surendranath Banerjee, we see the closest transposition of the poses and conventions of the Western sculptural genre. The figure's swagger, flowing coat and trousers, lending itself to a perfect replication of its many colonial rivals. Yet for the sculptor, Devi Prasad, this early sculptural commission did not fully meet the measure of what he had hoped to achieve. It is with his later bronze figure of Mahatma Gandhi on his Dandi March that he felt he had made his most satisfying public sculpture for the nation. Executed over 2 years, completed in 1958, a decade after Gandhi's death, the sculptor had to finally take course to melting a bronze bust he had made of his own father, to meet an acute shortage of metal in the city, to correct and repair on time one leg of Gandhi that had been damaged in the process of its lifting onto this pedestal. We are invited to think here of an affective flow of molten bronze from the figure of Devi Prasad's own father to that of the father of the nation. Also from this original statue, carefully nurtured by its maker, to its replicas that would travel to several Indian cities. In the 1950s, Devi Prasad's Gandhi takes its canonical place along with his other monumental public sculptural works like The Triumph of Labor, or like the Martyrs' Memorial, with Gandhi leading a group of revolutionary leaders. These came to produce an official socialist realist iconography for the new nation, much in the Soviet style. Dislodging Foley's sculpture of General Outram, which had stood for 84 years at the Park Street Chorangi crossing, the installation in this prime location of the city's first statue of Gandhi, with Prime Minister Nehru coming down to preside over its opening, marks a key moment in the history of Calcutta's post-colonial statuary. I'll end with a postscript. In his essay, Replica, Aura, and Late Official Nationalism, Benedict Anderson reflects on what he sees as the specific commemorative difficulties and imaginative impasse of all late official nationalisms, that is, nationalisms that are marked to states. We could extend his argument to think about the similar impasse and representational vacuity that spilled over into sculptures like these. A caricatured copy of Foley's equestrian Outram of India's military hero, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, again riding a horse, which he is unlikely to have ever embarked on. Matters have rolled far further since the 60s, when this statue was installed, in directions that take us from acts of post-colonial mimicry to a state of post-colonial farce that it unintentionally takes apart and hollows out the very genre of the monumental civic statue. If the country's imperial and early national statuary was defined by the singularity of the sculpted figure and their careful location in public places, the contemporary career of the genre is driven by a reverse logic of continuous repetition and overproduction to glub the vision and to render each repeating copy more and more meaningless. If the coming into being of this form of the statue was once the domain of special artistic competitions and commissions and of the expensive material of bronze and marble, the field today belongs to more cheap recyclable material like cement, plaster of Paris, and fiberglass, and to an unknown array of image makers, frequently with neither hereditary nor professional training, who are making a livelihood for this unceasing demand for public statues. Paint, once abhorred within this genre of civic statuary, is now frequently used to mimic and mock the prestige of marble or bronze, with the division collapsing between the painted icons of roadside gods and goddesses and their human counterpart. Let me end by underlining once more the unending paradox of the post-colonial fate of a once imperial genre, one in which the inheritance of colonial statuary, now emptied of the imperial past, linger on with grace, as we've seen, in the shades and shadows of grand edifices, while the nation's own glorious pantheon leaders, whether it be of the military hero Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, or the religious reformist and monk Swami Vivekananda, who we see on the left as a colored statue, or the world-renowned literature Rabindranath Tagore, painted a bronze color. It is they who are subjected to a new ignominy of becoming statues in every nook and corner of the city, in shapes, sizes, and forms that often bring them more ridicule than respect. Thank you, and I'm sorry for overshooting my time.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm sort of curious if you can speak a little bit more about the liminal sort of status between sort of sculpture and I think you call sculpture an icon. You know, I'm also thinking about sort of Diana X, sort of the Indian way of seeing, and that sort of course, I don't want to sort of overgeneralize, but that way of thinking about interactive figural statues, right? So much of these statues are really both colonial and also post-colonial are figural statues. So if you can sort of speak a little bit more in the thinking about sort of these figural statues in general. Thank you.
The sound wasn't very good, but what I understood was this question about the liminal status of statuary in general, between never quite figuring as works of art or as popular icons. And I can speak for India, where a lot of popular religious iconography or popular iconography of film stars, political leaders inhabit the cityscape. Statues are struggling for visibility. And here I'm reminded of Robert Musil's famous statement on how nothing is more invisible than some of these statuaries. And this is the political fate. So it is this liminal status that I look at, that the importance of their commemoration, their commemorative value, and whether what was their status during the time of empire would be something to ask, as against what would be their status now, which is something I explore, where they occupy areas which are part of imperial edifices, like the Barakpur Cantonment, Flagstaff House, or the Victoria Memorial, which is a highly kind of populated tourist space. Everybody flocks there to the city, both city residents. But they have become completely anonymous. Nobody knows who they are. And nobody cares who they are to even find out. So what's interesting is how colonial statuary is today searched out largely by Western scholars, British scholars. And Indian scholars, often Indian art students, study these as fine works of equestrian or standing sculpture without any interest on who they may be. So this is what I talk about, statues being emptying of personhood, right? Whether they be of nationalist leaders who now keep repeating themselves, and where the statues become smaller, often more disproportionate, often painted like icons. So here I'm looking at statues struggling to find a place, and statue makers like Devi Prasad, who I looked at, who's known to be an official sculptor of the nation. But now, what happened to the Indian statue maker is a big question. There are statues being made, but one gets to know almost nothing about those who make them. So here I'm trying and understand the figure, this figural form, this commemorative form, an imperial genre, which then is taken over by ex-colonial nations across the world, right? How effective? Why does it survive in this form? Why is it that modern sculptors do not take over empty pedestals and do experimental work as they did for instance, in Bucharest with the fall of the Lenin statue? So we don't have artists being asked to come in and play with empty pedestals. Rather, we have nationalist statues coming up and then them being replicated over and over again. So I don't know whether I fully answered the question, but this is this liminal status, both between work of art and a popular icon, but also between being a colonial relic and now becoming a nationalist icon, that I wish to place this object of statuary.
Any other questions, please come to the table.
Thank you very much. It occurs to me that, well, obviously, it is peculiar, this practice of, as you call it, post-colonial mimicry, and it does, well, it highlights a number of things. I think one of them is quite clearly that although there have been examples of, you know, attempts to define new kinds of languages for these, you know, for memorial sculpture of some kind, but it's almost as if as a genre, it has to contend with the fact that you know, if you think back to the 19th century, the practice of the monument was it was also part of a larger context in which, you know, the notion of the public sphere existed. And then, of course, if you're in a society where that sense of a public sphere doesn't exist in the same way it used to, then the audience for these things has kind of disappeared. And I half wonder whether that's part of the problem as well, is that, you know, who are they for? I mean, obviously in a country like India, which is so diverse anyway, then, you know, that sense that you can just appeal to some kind of common shared public sphere is going to be very problematic anyway. So it's questions both to do with the extent to which a genre, the language of a genre, and a certain kind of iconography has been exhausted, as well as the question of, you know, the audience, and that is interesting because it also what a lot of sort of campaigners against these objects, you know, they campaign against them as if they attribute them some kind of agency. And it seems to me that they can only have agency if people know who they're of. And so often, yes, these are entirely forgotten people. And I remember, you know, there was a very famous case in Britain, in Bristol, of this, you know, this statue that was pulled down, and it caused a great deal of you know, controversy. I had no idea, and I think most people had never heard of this person.
I know this is of somebody called Colby or somebody like that, right?
Yeah, I can't even remember.
This is during the Black Lives movement.
That's right, Colston, who, you know, back in the early 1700s, he'd been a slave owner and obviously a very problematic figure. But most, you know, it's just oblivion, you know, and yet the idea, you just think the very fact of being offended by that statue, it must have required quite a degree of research actually in order to define, you know, who was it, and, you know, so it's interesting that agency is attributed, which I personally I sometimes wonder about what's going on there. But does anyone else have any? Yeah, sorry.
Just to respond, you know, in this wonderful piece called Statues in the Square, Deborah Cherry asked, what are these figures of Nelson and Havelock, many of them from the Indian Empire? What are they doing in the square? Nobody knows who they are. And why must they remain there? Now, very interestingly, you raised the issue of public sphere. The imperial public sphere is one, and many of the areas in which these statues come up are not areas where Indians would have easily moved around very much. There is the White City and there's the Black Town. Now, there is greater and greater takeover of these public spaces, the areas around Victoria Memorial, Red Road, Esplanade, with the nationalist movement. So that's also interesting that the 20th century city develops a new Indian public sphere, both for political agitation and for the creation of public statuary through Indian subscription. So it's interesting that Indian statue makers do not sculpt figures of imperial rulers, though there is actually bronze casting done in India. It's always, the commissions entirely go to sculptors abroad. So the Indian sculptor has to fight to find a place to make these sculptures. And so that's interesting. There's a huge public sphere, mass public sphere, which these statues of nationalist leaders now inhabit. But they continue to remain an ignominy because they are repeatedly made, but almost emptied of personhood. So it seems like some commemorative procedure which replicates itself again and again. So I'm showing you the figures of Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, you know, painted bronze, a kind of awkward, disproportionate figure. So people are talking about, on one hand, the loss of the fine art of public statuary, and are questioning the necessity for these again and again. But these questions have not halted the career at all. In fact, it continues to proliferate. And that is a paradox. So while the imperial statuary kind of somewhere rest in grace, even though in oblivion, and are have to be searched out and can be studied. It's the other statuary which inhabit the chaos and congestion of the city that seems to be emptied of meaning even more.
Yeah, no. Right. Okay, good. Well, in that case, if we can just conclude by thanking you once more for a really interesting talk, and yeah, and the offer to submit a paper, gladly received. Thank you very much. It's